Hello, my name is Marcia Spink, and I'm the Associate Director for Air Programs with EPA's Region 3 office in Philadelphia. I'm here to present an overview of the Clean Air Act's requirements for state implementation plan development and approval. Some of the things we're going to cover today are going to be the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. We're going to cover the Clean Air Act Section 110 and 40 CFR Part 51, criteria air pollutants, the difference between a SIP and a SIP revision, the different types of SIP revisions, the components of a SIP, clean data findings versus redesignations, regulatory versus non-regulatory SIPs, what do we mean by SIP credit, what is a rate of progress plan, what is an attainment plan, what's a maintenance plan, and lastly, what are federal implementation plans. The Clean Air Act requires EPA to set national ambient air quality standards for pollutants considered harmful to the public and to the environment. The Clean Air Act provides EPA the authority to promulgate two types of national ambient air quality standards. The primary standards set limits to protect public health, including the health of sensitive populations such as asthmatics, children, and the elderly. Secondary standards set limits to protect public welfare, including protection against decreased visibility, damage to plants, crops, and animals, and vegetation, and also to buildings. For example, many times you'll notice that in our public buildings, you'll get the threshold or the front steps of buildings that become loose because the mortar has been damaged. That's actually some of the effects of acid rain. You can actually also see that on some of our statues and public monuments. The secondary NAAQS for a given criteria pollutant is equal to or more stringent than the primary National Ambient Air Quality Standards for that same pollutant. And this is because certain species of plant and animal life are greatly impacted by air pollution, even more so than human beings. These are the criteria air pollutants: particulate matter, and we have them for PM10 and PM2.5. What this means is the diameter of the particle in microns: sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, ozone, and lead. These criteria air pollutants are the pollutants for which EPA has set a national ambient air quality standard. These are the pollutants for which state implementation plans are required. So, for example, there's no such thing as a mercury SIP. Even though mercury is a regulated pollutant under the Clean Air Act, we don't have them for SIPs because they're not a criteria air pollutant or a pollutant for which EPA has set a national ambient air quality standard. 40 CFR Part 50, and this point on EPA's website is where you can find the table of the current National Ambient Air Quality Standards. In a shorthand, we call them the NAAQS. When you take a look at 40 CFR Part 50 or you go to this place on the website, the footnotes are key. So what is the SIP? The State Implementation Plan is the air pollution reduction measures and strategies adopted by a state and approved by EPA for attaining and maintaining the NAAQS. Every state in the country, as well as our territories, have a subpart that can be found in 40 CFR Part 52. So each state's SIP has been codified in the Code of Federal Regulations in 40 CFR Part 52. EPA regional administrators are delegated the authority to receive, return, approve, or disapprove state implementation plans submitted by states to EPA. Now, this is a common issue that comes up. What is the difference between the SIP and SIP revisions? Well, strictly speaking, the state implementation plan is everything that's been codified in a state subpart of 40 CFR Part 52. One of the most interesting things that can happen is for an EPA person in a region to get a telephone call from someone who said, "Can you send me a copy of the Pennsylvania SIP?" And what we'll say is, "Well, are you going to pull a truck up to the loading dock?" What happens is these are very big documents, but strictly speaking, the SIP is everything that's been codified in 40 CFR Part 52. The ozone SIP, that's the attainment plan and all of the SIP elements that have been adopted by a state and approved to control ozone precursors. A VOC racked SIP is a Part D element, Part D of the Clean Air Act. It's a Part D element of the ozone attainment plan to control volatile organic compounds from existing major stationary sources. Now, strictly speaking, a VOC rack SIP is a SIP revision. The I&M SIP. This is a SIP element required in certain non-attainment areas for vehicle inspection and maintenance. So what I'm trying to get across is that while the true SIP is everything for all pollutants that have been codified in a subpart of 40 CFR Part 52 for a given state, everybody in the air quality planning field tends to use the word SIP whether they mean the whole SIP or an individual SIP revision. Now, the SIP is the state's plan to improve air quality in non-attainment areas such that those areas will attain the primary NAAQS by a statutory deadline. The SIP is also the state's plan to ensure that the attainment areas continue to meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. What I'm saying here is that the Clean Air Act requires states to not only devise control strategies and plans to achieve the National Ambient Air Quality Standards set to protect human health for their areas that currently don't meet the standard, but there are also SIP requirements that apply even where a state has areas that are in attainment or where the air quality is better than the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. The components of a SIP. This plan, called the State Implementation Plan, and is required under Section 110 of the Clean Air Act. You can also find the requirements for state implementation plans in 40 CFR Part 51. Note 40 CFR Part 51 subparts F and G. These subparts describe the requirements for what we term the control strategy SIPs. For example, rate of progress plans and attainment demonstrations. I'll discuss more about these later on in the presentation. In general, the SIP requires a collection of programs and resources, including a monitoring program, a collection of monitoring devices throughout the country which provide actual measurements of the concentrations in the air. This ambient air quality data that's generated by these monitors is used to calculate, among other things, a given geographical area's design value. Design values. This term is key when it comes to air quality planning. An area's design value identifies whether an area should be designated as attainment for a National Ambient Air Quality Standard or non-attainment. Now, the design value is really is a number that EPA and the states apply a statistical approach to the real data that's generated by the monitor to come up with an area's design value. In other words, what do we deem to be the air quality in that given geographical area? And again, a design value is calculated from monitoring data that is collected in the field. Some of you have probably seen monitoring stations. You'll notice that there's a series of things in an open field with a fence around it. You can find an intersection in a city that seems to have some machines with louvers. Many times what you're actually looking at are the ambient air quality monitors that have been placed out there by the states to gather the air quality data necessary to determine what the design value of a given geographical area is. Design values are also used to determine whether an area is eligible for a clean data determination or to be eligible to be redesignated. In other words, you'll have a design value, and design values, as I said, are calculated usually by looking at 3 years' worth of actual ambient air quality data. And we apply a statistical approach to that data, and we come up with its design value. But it's a rolling 3 years. So as the air quality improves, you can find 3 years where you recalculate the design value for each 3-year period on a rolling basis, and there will be a time when we hope that the air quality will meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, meaning that its design value is now below or better than the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. When that's the case, an area is eligible for either a clean data determination, or it may be eligible to be redesignated to attainment. Another important component of SIPs is our emission inventories. Emission inventories are compiled data of the sources and categories of emissions to the air for a given pollutant and how much is emitted by each source or source category. Now, by source category, we can mean a number of things. We can mean from mobile sources versus stationary sources usually meaning from business and industry. Mobile sources, both on-road and off-road, from vehicles or for mobile construction equipment, what it takes place at airports. And a source category can also mean within the stationary source community, you could have a source category such as surface coaters versus printers versus chemical manufacturing. So the term source category can mean the categories within stationary sources, or it can mean the difference between mobile stationary area and biogenic sources. Biogenic sources meaning the naturally occurring pollution that's out there. The other thing that's important for the SIP to consider and have are air quality calculations and computer modeling. These are methodologies and tools to predict future trends and the effects of emission reduction strategies, and they're also used to produce the attainment demonstration. Now, computer models, there are various kinds. We're talking in this case about air quality planning models. What happens with air quality planning models is that unlike data where you are reading directly from monitoring data from monitors that are placed in the field, these are computer tools and methodologies that you can input meteorological data and emissions data and future emissions data to predict whether or not the state has adopted sufficient control strategies to produce an attainment demonstration. Control strategy studies. The goal of control strategy studies is to determine how best, meaning both how best environmentally and from a cost-benefit perspective, to reduce emissions in order to meet the ambient air quality standards. For example, let's say that the monitoring data indicated a given geographical area was non-attainment, meaning that its air quality was worse than the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So the state starts to decide, how am I going to get the emissions in the air reduced so that the monitors will read attainment? And we know that the air quality is in attainment. Well, let's say that in the course of doing your SIP planning, you find that you need a 50% reduction. Well, you wouldn't want to do a 50% reduction from every little small source. What you take a look at instead is perhaps it's more effective to control certain larger sources for a 90% reduction. But basically what the control strategy studies do is that it's the state's ability to take a look at different control strategies and options to reduce emissions in the air, to improve the air quality so they can produce an attainment demonstration which indicates that the air quality has returned to below the health-based standard. Now, the formal adoption of measures and regulations that are enforceable by EPA, states, and by citizen suits to ensure that reductions deemed necessary in the planning process will be achieved. What this means is that the state has to have the authority under state law to be able to adopt the necessary regulations that would be required to control emissions of air pollution, so that those regulations can then be enforced by the state, submitted to EPA, and EPA will conduct a rulemaking process to approve them. And only after EPA has conducted the rulemaking process to approve a SIP revision submitted by the state does it become federally enforceable. And once it's in the SIP and it's federally enforceable, it may be enforced by EPA, the state, because it is a state regulation, but also by citizen suit. SIP components. The state also needs to have the authority to do a periodic review to evaluate whether or not those needed reductions were achieved in reality or in practice, and whether they had the predicted result. What we're talking about here is the fact that the states adopt control strategies, and they usually have a compliance date or effective date that can be months after the adoption process. They submit that to EPA. EPA has approved it, and what we're with the belief that when those control strategies go into place, that we will see the improvement in air quality that were predicted by the models that evaluated the control strategy that produced the attainment demonstration. But as a number of years may pass between the adoption of the control strategies and the date by which the air quality was supposed to attain the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, we can sometimes require something called a mid-course review or a periodic review to make sure that the emission reductions are on track. The air quality agency responsible for the SIP is usually a state agency, but it may also be a local agency or a tribal agency. And they must have procedures to provide the public an opportunity to review a SIP revision before sending it to EPA for approval. This is a key component of the Clean Air Act. It was Congress's intent that the public should have an active role in the development of state implementation plans. So under Section 110 of the Clean Air Act, the state must conduct procedures for every SIP revision it's going to submit to EPA, where they offer a 30-day public comment period, and they give very specific instructions in a public notice, usually published in a newspaper of general circulation around the state, or at least in the geographical area for which the SIP is being developed. It tells the public where they can view this SIP revision. That's going to be submitted to EPA. It provides the information about the pollutant, and it invites public comment, and it provides the opportunity for a public hearing. In some cases, the public hearing is automatically scheduled as part of the public notice, and it doesn't require a separate request from the public in order to have the public hearing. It gives the public instructions as to what is being adopted, when it's going to be submitted to EPA, and the reason behind the controls that are the regulations that are being adopted. The public sends the comments is given instructions for exactly where to provide comments. They may also appear and give oral testimony at a public hearing. In cases where the EPA fails to approve a SIP, the agency can issue and enforce a Federal Implementation Plan, or FIP, to ensure attainment and maintenance of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. FIPs are not popular. States would rather take care of their own business, and the regulated community within a state is usually a lot more comfortable with the state doing the job under the Clean Air Act. When I said that if EPA fails to approve a SIP, EPA may also be required to promulgate a FIP for a given geographical area where the state fails to submit the required SIP revision. So whether the state failed to submit the required SIP revision or EPA has to disapprove a SIP revision submitted by a state because we feel it does not meet the requirements of the Clean Air Act and 40 CFR Part 51, the agency by law is required to promulgate a Federal Implementation Plan, again to assure attainment and maintenance of the health-based National Ambient Air Quality Standards. In addition, Section 179 of the Clean Air Act contains penalties, referred to as sanctions, which EPA can impose in areas not satisfying the Act's Part D SIP requirements. A little bit about Part D. Part D of the Clean Air Act, in addition to Section 110, it has to be looked at in combination when a state is planning a SIP for a designated non-attainment area. Part D of the Clean Air Act refers to the additional requirements for a given non-attainment area. So not only do you have the general requirements that you find under Section 110, in Part D there will be additional requirements specifically for non-attainment areas. These tend to get more stringent depending upon the severity of the non-attainment area, meaning the worse the air quality is in a given area, the more likely there'll be additional Clean Air Act requirements. Now, when we talk about the sanctions, what will happen is that EPA will issue either a finding of failure to submit or perhaps a finding of incompleteness to a state if it either did not submit a required SIP revision at all, or the one it submitted was incomplete. That would start, that finding by EPA commences what we call the sanction and FIP clocks. If the sanction clock, once commenced, goes all the way to 18 months, there's an automatic 2-for-1 offset requirement under the new source review program. What that means is that if the state continues to fail, does not give the required SIP revision to EPA in that geographical area, in order to bring a new industry in, the company would have to find reductions in air quality equal to twice as much of the pollution as they would put out once they were built and operational. If the state has still not satisfied the deficiency for which it got a finding of failure to submit, a finding of incompleteness, or a disapproval, in 24 months, the highway sanctions can kick in. What that means is that the state becomes ineligible for its federal highway money in that geographical area, except for some safety projects. The loss of federal highway money to a state is extremely serious. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. So states do their best to submit their SIPs and SIP revisions on time, knowing that they could get a finding of failure to submit or a finding of incompleteness or a disapproval. Now, once the clocks have commenced by these types of findings, the FIP clock is also rolling. And what that means is that EPA has 2 years from the time it makes a finding of failure to submit, incompleteness, or disapproval to promulgate the federal implementation plan. What's interesting is if the state submits the SIP and it got a finding of failure to submit, that will stop the sanction clock. If the state continues to supplement its SIP so that if it got a finding of incompleteness, the SIP is now complete, that will stop the sanction clock. But nothing stops the FIP clock. Okay? Until EPA actually approves the SIP, the FIP clock continues to roll. One thing that's also interesting, if a state gets a finding for a disapproval, submittal of the SIP will not stop that sanction clock. Only EPA approval will stop that sanction clock. Now I'm going to talk to you about something called the infrastructure SIPs. You can find these in section 110A1 and 2A through M of the Clean Air Act. Now, these requirements, the infrastructure SIPs, are required 3 years after EPA promulgates a new National Ambient Air Quality Standard or revises a National Ambient Air Quality Standard. This is key. Regardless of whether or not the state has any non-attainment areas for that new NAAQS or the revised National Ambient Air Quality Standard, it still owes an infrastructure SIP to EPA 3 years after promulgation. What's interesting is that we focus so much on the designation process to designate areas as non-attainment or attainment, and then when usually 3 years from that point in time, we need to have what's the Part D SIP to cure any non-attainment problems. But what is required here for the infrastructure SIPs is, again, regardless of whether or not a state has any non-attainment areas, it still owes the infrastructure SIP. And the 3-year deadline is set in the statute. Now, what makes this so interesting is, just to give you an example of what can happen when we forget these requirements. When we promulgated the new National Ambient Air Quality Standard for ozone in 1997 and the first PM 2.5 standard, because there were lawsuits on the standards themselves, EPA didn't promulgate what's called the implementation rule for those pollutants for a number of years, and so the actual non-attainment plan wasn't due for a number of years. We all sort of forgot about the infrastructure SIPs that were due to EPA 3 years after 1997 or the year 2000. Well, EPA and the states were sued by national environmental groups to get the infrastructure SIPs done. We don't forget them anymore. And basically what the infrastructure SIPs are as follows. The infrastructure SIPs, particularly under Section 110A1, that's what talks about the need for a state to have the ability to conduct the public participation procedures on SIP revisions. In other words, the ability to put a public notice out and to hold a hearing informing the public of how they're changing the SIP. When you get to 110A2, A through M, that talks about all of the requirements that a state agency has to have under the Clean Air Act before it is deemed eligible or qualified to do air quality planning. In other words, to produce attainment demonstrations and plans. So if you take a look at 110A2, A through M, you'll see things like the need to have sufficient resources and expertise, the need to have the ability to do modeling, the need to be able to have the authority to adopt regulations. But there's some interesting things to watch for in 110A2, especially look for cross-references to Part D. You'll recall that earlier I said that Part D of the Clean Air Act are the provisions that are especially required for non-attainment areas. So while Section 110A, 1 and 2 apply for all states regardless of whether or not they are non-attainment or attainment for a new or revised NAAQS, there are also cross-references to Part D. The other things to pay particular attention to in the infrastructure requirements is that Section 110A2D deals with transport. What this means is the state must have sufficient authority to control pollution from sources in its state that are interfering with another state's ability to plan for attainment of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. What we found before 1990, and much of this has now, states that now have the authority, is with the problem that we faced where many states only had the authority to adopt regulations on their sources if the monitors in that state read non-attainment. So in other words, if their sources were causing a problem but not with the ambient air quality in that state, some states did not have the authority to regulate them. The Clean Air Act of 1990 filled in this gap. In order to satisfy the infrastructure requirements, a state agency must have the ability to control pollution from its sources if it is determined through the use of the technical analyses that emissions from that state are contributing to non-attainment in a downwind state. The other thing with regard to Section 110A2 is that states need to pay attention to both the non-attainment new source review permitting requirements and the Part C prevention of significant deterioration permitting program requirements, especially for a new criteria pollutant for which we've promulgated a national ambient air quality standard. What we found is that many states' PSD programs, which many of you know is the permitting program for major new and modified sources in attainment areas, what we found was that some states specified the pollutants, and if we promulgated a standard for a new criteria pollutant, their PSD permitting program could be deficient in that it did not address that new criteria pollutant. So when we tell our states, look, you've got to take a look at your existing SIP elements to make sure you satisfy the infrastructure requirements, we particularly ask states to make sure that both their non-attainment new source review permitting program and their Part C of the Clean Air Act prevention of significant deterioration permitting program address the new criteria pollutant. Even if a state believes that no updates are necessary to its current plan in order to satisfy the infrastructure requirements of Section 110, even that determination must be taken out to public notice and public hearing for public participation on that determination. In other words, because the states for over 30 years have had the ability to do non-attainment area planning and attainment area planning, they often believe that they have all of the necessary infrastructure requirements already taken care of. And even though EPA has promulgated a new National Ambient Air Quality Standard for a new criteria pollutant, or revised a National Ambient Air Quality Standard for an existing criteria pollutant, if that state says, I'm all set, I don't need to do any SIP revisions to satisfy the infrastructure requirements of Section 110, even that determination by that state must be shown to the public and given the opportunity to make sure that the public agrees. And even that determination must be submitted to EPA. SIPs versus Title V permits. Most of you know that the Clean Air Act of 1990 introduced a new permitting program under the Clean Air Act, and that was operating permit programs, and they're required under Title V, whereas SIPs are required under Title I of the Clean Air Act. Title V permits may not be used to create or fix SIP requirements. What's happened is, because Title V permits are federally enforceable, you get the situation where some states thought that they could leave the SIP general and put the details of an individual source's requirements in their Title V program, or, in their Title V permit. But you cannot use a Title V permit to fix the SIP. In other words, if the SIP has a deficiency, meaning it does not properly regulate a stationary source or category of stationary sources, the state can't fix the SIP by taking care of that in the source's Title V permit. But I will say this, a state may choose to issue a Title V permit to a source, then submit that Title V permit, either all of it or a portion of it, to EPA for approval as a SIP revision. Title V permits house existing SIP requirements and all other applicable federal and state requirements. Title V permits have a federal section and a state section. What goes into the Title V permit? All these things. Title I requirements, existing SIP requirements, the state permit program requirements, the acid rain provisions of Title IV, it may be the air toxics provisions of Title III, and it may be enforcement provisions. All of those go into a Title V permit. A Title V permit was an operating permit program, and a source's Title V permit is used to house all of its federal and state requirements to control air pollution. Now, someone could say, well, why can't, as long as a Title V permit is federally enforceable, if the SIP is deficient, why can't I take care of that in the source's Title V permit and close that gap? Because Title V permits are federally enforceable. For years, EPA told the states that in order to make something federally enforceable, it had to be submitted as a SIP revision. So once Title V permits were federally enforceable, there was some confusion as to why you couldn't use a Title V permit to fix a SIP. But the issue is not federal enforceability. Nothing is made part of the SIP until and unless it goes through the state and federal processes required to codify it in 40 CFR Part 52 pursuant to Section 110 of the Clean Air Act. In other words, to make something part of the SIP, it must go through the process as outlined in Section 110, and it must be submitted to EPA. EPA conducts federal rulemaking to approve it, make it part of the state SIP, and then it will be codified in that state's subpart of Part 52. SIP requirements cannot be open-ended, with the details to be set in the Title V permit. Recently, a SIP revision was submitted to our regional office, and it was to control visible emissions. It had a general provision for controlling visible emissions, but then what the state regulations said was that they would conduct source testing, and then for each source determine what its emission rate should be and would set it in the Title V permit. That SIP revision was sent back to the state, and the state was told, if you resubmit it, we'll have to disapprove it. The SIP itself must contain the requirements for the sources being regulated. SIP revision requests to approve documents or regulations with expiration or sunset dates can pose approvability problems. Now, let's talk about why this would be the case. Let's say that a state chose to, rather than adopt a statewide regulation for a given category of sources, the state finds out that it only has 1 or 2 sources of that type in the entire state. So rather than adopt a statewide regulation, it may choose to issue a permit to that or a plan approval, which is legal under state law, to those sources and impose what it would have imposed in a regulation. The state then wants to say, I will give these permits to EPA as a SIP revision to approve and make part of my SIP. Well, the problem is if permits often have expiration or sunset dates, and if we took that document with an expiration or sunset date and approved it as part of the SIP, it would go away, and the SIP is not allowed to go away. Under law, federal law, the SIP remains the SIP until a formal SIP revision is submitted. So the reason why there are problems approving SIPs with sunset or expiration dates is they would in effect make the SIP disappear, and that's not allowed under the law. Now we're going to talk about designations. EPA has just promulgated a new National Ambient Air Quality Standard for a new criteria pollutant, or it has revised the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for an existing criteria pollutant. This is because EPA is required to review the National Ambient Air Quality Standards every 5 years to make sure, given the latest science and information, that in fact that is the appropriate standard to protect public health and welfare. Once a new standard is promulgated or revised, we have to find out what areas of the country are non-attainment, meaning the air quality in those areas does not meet this health-based standard. Well, what we do is we have to take a look at 3 years worth of data, and within that data we usually have a baseline year. But first we look at the 3 years worth of data and we determine the design value for that area. As you will recall, I mentioned design values earlier in the presentation. A design value is the statistical number that is calculated from the ambient air quality data that is actually recorded for a given pollutant in a geographical area. If that design value is higher than the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, then the area is non-attainment. Now, once an area is determined to be non-attainment, you have to say, well, how big is the area? What should its boundaries be? Under the Clean Air Act, sort of by default, we recommend that states use the metropolitan statistical area or the consolidated metropolitan statistical area as the sort of default boundaries for a non-attainment area. However, a state may make a recommendation for a larger or a smaller area in order to do its air quality planning. Even though the states are encouraged to submit their recommendations, and usually these recommendations come in the form of a letter from the governor to EPA, the ultimate decision for setting the boundaries does rest with the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, metropolitan statistical areas and consolidated metropolitan statistical areas are basically census terms. What's interesting is that you can have a non-attainment area that's entirely within a state. For example, in the state of Maryland, you have the Baltimore non-attainment area for ozone. That non-attainment area is a metropolitan statistical area. It consists of the city of Baltimore and some surrounding areas, whereas the consolidated metropolitan statistical area, let's take an example. It's called the Philadelphia, Wilmington, Atlantic City non-attainment area. It is the only 4-state non-attainment area in the country. It crosses 2 EPA, not only does it cross 4 states, it crosses 2 EPA regions. Planning in the Philadelphia area requires a great deal of cooperation between the states of Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So air quality planning may be done by a state for a given area entirely located within that state, but some states may be faced with having to deal with their neighboring states for a single non-attainment area. Another example is the New York City area. It's comprised of counties in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. So again, the state may have to actually do its air quality planning in conjunction with its neighboring states. The District of Columbia, the non-attainment area, is comprised of the district, counties in Virginia, and counties in Maryland. So I just wanted to make the point that a state's job can be complicated if the non-attainment area is not solely within that state. When are attainment SIPs due? Usually they are due 3 years after an area is designated non-attainment. Now the specifics for what elements are required and what their deadlines are is usually found in what we call the implementation rule. After EPA promulgates a new National Ambient Air Quality Standard or revises an existing one, it puts out what's called the implementation rule for that pollutant. And it lays out a roadmap, if you will, for how to develop the non-attainment area SIP for that pollutant for that given non-attainment area. It tends to mirror the Part D requirements of the Clean Air Act. Someone might ask, well, okay, when you chose those 3 years to look at and you found that my design value was non-attainment and you designated that geographical area as non-attainment, what happens if the area's air quality improves before the SIP is due or before the attainment date of the area? A clean data determination is a determination that's made by EPA when the air quality of a given non-attainment area achieves the standard prior to the due date of the attainment plan or before the attainment date. If EPA makes a clean data determination, it relieves the state from having to do what's called a rate of progress plan, sometimes also called a reasonable further progress plan, and the attainment demonstration. Now, the benefits of this to a state can be huge from a resource perspective. The development of a non-attainment area plan, whether it be a rate of progress plan or an attainment demonstration, is obviously very resource intensive. The whole purpose of a rate of progress plan under the Clean Air Act was a plan to go year by year for air quality improvements until the deadline of the Clean Air Act when the area was supposed to achieve the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. And the whole purpose for the attainment demonstration was a demonstration usually done with computer modeling that demonstrates that with the control strategies adopted by a state, that by the statutory deadline, that area will have achieved the NAAQS. So obviously, if the state air quality in a given area achieves the National Ambient Air Quality Standard prior to the time it was required to under the statute, there is really no need for a rate of progress plan or an attainment demonstration, and it relieves the state from that burden. But to be clear, a clean data determination still leaves the area designated non-attainment. The benefit of a clean data determination is that it relieves the state from having to do the rate of progress plan and attainment demonstration SIPs. Now, for a clean data determination, the state may request or EPA may initiate the action. A clean data determination requires rulemaking. And while not a SIP revision, language is codified in the state subpart of Part 52. If all that's going on in the rulemaking being conducted by EPA is to make a clean data determination, sometimes called a clean data finding, the only thing that happens is that the state is relieved of having to do the rate of progress plan and the attainment demonstration. It is not a redesignation. Redesignation meaning that you formally redesignate the area from non-attainment to attainment. That gets codified in Part 81. So a clean data determination on its own is not a revision to Part 81. And we're talking about Part 81 of the Code of Federal Regulations. On the other hand, a redesignation requires a state to submit requests satisfying 5 requirements of the Clean Air Act, and those requirements are found in Section 107, actually 107E. A maintenance plan is a critical element, and it is a SIP revision. One of those 5 requirements for redesignation is a maintenance plan, and the maintenance plan is the plan that the state provides as part of its redesignation request that will project attainment out for 10 years from the time it is redesignated. A redesignation of an area means that you are literally redesignating it from non-attainment to attainment. This also requires rulemaking, and you codify this rulemaking in both Part 52 and in Part 81. Now, the reason that you have to codify in Part 52 is the maintenance plan is a SIP revision, and the maintenance plan, therefore, has to be codified in the state subpart of 40 CFR Part 52. The redesignation itself, the rulemaking action being taken by EPA to formally change the designation of a given geographical area from non-attainment to attainment, is codified in 40 CFR Part 81. Requirements for clean data determinations versus redesignations. Clean data finding or a clean data determination, 3 years worth of violation-free data. Violation-free data that has been quality assured, quality controlled, and has been input into the proper databases. A redesignation, you need 3 years of violation-free data, a fully approved 110 SIP, that's the infrastructure SIP that I talked about earlier. The Part D SIP requirements due to date must have been submitted and approved. The improvement in air quality must come from enforceable reductions, and the approved maintenance plan must be approvable as a SIP revision, including contingency measures. And let me talk about redesignations a little bit more. These are the 5 requirements. So first of all, you have to have clean data. The most recent 3 years worth of data after it's been QA'd and QC'd must show a design value that is below the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. Then the state has had to have satisfied the infrastructure SIP requirements that we talked about under Section 110, A1 and A2. The Part D SIP requirements for that given non-attainment area must have been adopted, submitted to EPA, and approved. And by these Part D requirements, we mean the Part D requirements that had come due up until the date of submittal of a complete redesignation request and maintenance plan. The 4th criterion is improvement in air quality from enforceable reductions. Why this is so important is there have been times when we have a series of cool summers which can lower the readings of ozone, and it can appear that the air quality has improved, but not from enforceable reductions, simply from different meteorological conditions, or perhaps there's been a change in that area's economic status so that business and industries have gone from 3 shifts down to 1 shift. In other words, the improvement in air quality is not from things that are enforceable. We can't enforce the weather, and there would be nothing preventing that source, should it get the business back and the economic upturn, to go back to 2 or 3 shifts a day. So there has to be a demonstration by the state that the improvement in air quality came from enforceable reductions. And lastly, and very important, the SIP revision aspect of a redesignation request is an approved maintenance plan, and the plan has to project attainment out for 10 years. We tell states to prepare their maintenance plans for 12 years, and the reason for that is under the Clean Air Act, the maintenance plan has to project attainment for 10 years after the area has been redesignated. Remember, EPA has to conduct notice and comment rulemaking on every SIP revision, including the maintenance plan. By the time we finish the rulemaking process, we may have had to take a year. In fact, the Clean Air Act allows up to 18 months for EPA to take action on a maintenance plan in order to approve it. If the state only did a plan that was good for 10 years from the time it submitted it to EPA, chances are by the time we approved it, it would no longer be 10 years from the date of redesignation. That's why we ask states to please plan their maintenance plan for 12 years to account for the time it will take to conduct federal rulemaking to approve that maintenance plan as a SIP revision. Interesting and very important, approved maintenance plans will include contingency measures.